Awesome. Thanks for having me out here, everybody, and for coming out. And I know we all have full stomachs now, and it's a cozy room, so let's try to stay awake. I'll do my best to stay awake as well. Um, so I know we have like a large audience of high school students, so I kind of wanted to incorporate some of that into the talk um, and kind of give you some of my background on where I was coming from before I got into photography. And I know you guys, some of the yearbook students and other students and high school students are doing things with photography now. So when I was in high school, I was about to, I was like basically not going to finish. And I ended up being a father at 17, and I was finishing my senior year. And at that time, I had no intentions of going to college ever. Didn't have any thoughts of like pursuing photography or anything else for that matter, other than I was going to actually go work at the shipyard and work as an apprentice there as an electrician. But during my time there, I did take my first introduction to kind of like the power of visual communications was working for the student paper. And it was actually a class I took because I thought, I'm okay with writing and I can use a camera all right, and it'll be an easy way to get a grade to satisfy credit. But unknown to me, it was also, I was excited. I actually really enjoyed it. And I also ended up putting out, back then we were doing a little like punk zine. It was like a DIY punk zine because I was really big into skateboarding. So we put out this little magazine, like my friend and I put this little Xerox machine magazine out, and I'd take pictures and we'd write. So as a high school student, that's kind of what I was into, and that's what I was doing, and it led me into photography unknowingly and without real intent. And that leads you to like my first interest in photography really was just like documenting skateboarding. Like I would photograph my friends, and I would photograph the culture around the skateboarding, whether it was fighting somebody else or fighting among each other. But I was always the one taking pictures, and I don't really know why that was the case. It just kind of like I just became the guy that would take everyone's photographs. And back then, of course, everything was shot on film because we didn't have the accessibility that we have now with photography. So I would, in fact, a lot of times I had the camera, but my friends would pay for the film and the developing, and I would just shoot the pictures. And that's kind of how we worked. So my introduction to photography really grew from just the necessity of just wanting to document and photograph my friends, but with no real intent of like our purpose. It was just really something I gravitated towards. And then that, at the same time, I would always look at skateboarding magazines, and whenever they would document the skaters on different trips that they went to and stuff, there was always like street photography, like people photographing just on-staged moments that were happening in front of them, whether they were visiting somewhere in Europe or they were, in some other travel destination for a skate demo or what have you. They would always insert the action photos, but then they'd also have pictures of where these people were visiting. So it was almost like a visual anthropology in addition to like action photography and so it just kind of came hand in hand. And also at the same time, I started seeing my first photography books, and it was street photography. I didn't know that's what it was called at the time, but I really, it really resonated with me. So I would continue to go out and basically shoot people on the street, finding photographs in the common everyday life. And I think we all do this. We all people watch. Maybe not so much now because we're all always looking at our phones, but if you put your phone down for a minute, there's like so many moments and so many things just to capture right in front of us. And then the third aspect or element of what I quite often did with my photography was, as I started studying photography with an intent to have a degree in it, I was single at the time, and I would often photograph people that I was dating or that were potentially becoming a romantic partner. And what I found from that in hindsight was like it would help me kind of, and photography in general would help me communicate something to myself that I wasn't necessarily aware of. Like a lot of times I'll take a photograph and it's more of just a response to a mood or a feeling or an emotion that I'm not even really aware of at the moment, but then when I go back and look at the images, something is communicated to me through that photograph. So often I would photograph people I was dating and look at the photos later and think and kind of study them and think about like how I was responding to them, and in that way it would in some way inform me of what my true intentions or my reactions were to that person. And so when I met my wife, Jasmine, I immediately was photographing her and continued to do that. We've been together for 20 years in November at this point, but I would, whether we were at home, and this was a long time ago, like I didn't even have a bed. We slept on the floor, literally. And we would go to parties and I'd shoot. And then we had our son, and I should back up too and say, as a high school student, I did mention I had my first child, and then I went on to have my son, and continued documenting that experience with the change, and starting to see like the changes in my wife becoming, because she was in her 20s when we first had Levi, and it was interesting as I looked through the photographs to see her, becoming more and more of a woman. And I would even whether the birth of our second child, I photographed Jasmine. While I'm encouraging her to, birth our second child, I'm also taking photographs. And I share all these things with you because photography for me, it just is a kind of an extension of who I am, and like I'm constantly always photographing different things in my life, and by photographing my family or people who have intimate relationships, and photographing skateboarding is something else that I build relationships with friends, or photographing the streets in my community. It just like hones in my skills, and I quite often will play a new technique or a new approach, and at some point you'll see that playing incorporated into larger bodies of work, which then at some point was eventually applied into my professional work as a photojournalist, which I did for about 15 or 20 years full time, and before I left to go into marketing and communications. And this particular this work that I'm showing you in here, these were all photographed at the last paper I was at in Norfolk, Virginia, where I was based for several years. And I actually was I lived in Mississippi, but I also lived in Virginia, and I would say mostly raised in Virginia. And in this particular community, when I went back and started working for this newspaper, it started dawning on me, people that I hadn't talked to in years were saying, "Hey, don't you work for the paper now? I saw your byline on your picture." And it could be anywhere from old teachers, my friends' parents that would run into me at the street. And then I was like, oh, damn, people know I'm here again. And it really put a very sense of responsibility to my community on me, because now I felt now I knew I was accountable. So like anything I put out there with my name on it in my community, it was gonna come back to me whether I heard about it or not. And it really made me feel a much larger sense of responsibility to how I was photographing and representing my community. And I also thought like it was an honor to be able to have the opportunity to be in such intimate moments and times. Like with this little girl, we were actually waiting for her father, who had been, was about to be released from being held in prison on murder charges that had eventually become dropped. And it was an amazing case because obviously, it's a black male that was arrested, and he was charged with murdering a police officer, and to have those charges dropped seemed like it would never happen, and they were dropped, and he was found innocent. And a big part of my community there was the military, and I grew up as a military brat. My dad served in the Navy for 20 plus years, so that was another thing that really connected me with the community that I was working in, is because I really could connect and draw from my own personal experiences. Like, for example, with this little boy, he was waiting for his dad. His dad had been away at war for 6 months, I think it was. Excuse me. And I really connected with him because I was that little 6-year-old or 5-year-old boy who would wait on the docks for his dad to return to the same place after being away and deployed for military purposes. So I really was tapping into kind of my home and to my life experiences, and trying to share that with our community. and you would end up covering tragedies too. Like in this case, it was a SUV full of Boy Scouts, and unfortunately, everyone perished in this crash. So that was like a week-long coverage of 5 deaths of young children, and it was really, it feels like a huge responsibility to represent and really convey the truth of the tragedy that had happened, and just more daily work of what my community looked like. And so, but the bonus of working for newspapers was you also got to work on long-term projects that created where you were working on developing a narrative arc. And we talked about this earlier. I know one of your teachers is teaching you about going out and selecting emotions, and like you've got this emotion to convey, or you have that emotion to convey. So from doing these regular single images that were just one image in the paper that you're trying to convey, like this assignment was basically go out and find me a picture that shows that spring or warm weather is coming. And so you're building these layers and you're creating stories within an image. But as you begin to hone your craft, you get the opportunity to develop longer narrative storytelling, which could incorporate anything from 5 images to 20, 30, 40 images or what have you. So, and often, you got the greatest part of being a photojournalist was that I would meet so many people from so many different walks of life, whether they were, poverty-stricken or, in the case when I lived in Abu Dhabi in the Middle East, it could be a sheikh who was a millionaire. And so you really got the opportunity to experience so many different people's lives, even if it was just for a minute. And this particular woman I met on an assignment where I was covering a pantry where they gave out food pantry to people who needed extra help in food, like just to be able to eat. And as I got to talking to her more and found out about her story, I realized that she was the great-great-grandmother of these 5 children that she had chosen to start raising because their parents were not able to provide the care that they needed. So after photographing her for that one assignment, I later went back and continued spending time with her and to share her story and almost I wanted to celebrate the fact that this woman was taking on such a great role after raising so many other of her own children and other relatives. And I just wanted to offer like a very intimate view of what faith it may have taken and what kind of relationships and roles that they played together. And I really love moments like this because it's just like a daily moment. It goes back to like the street photography that I started off doing, where you just find the world as a stage and there's so much to learn from what's right in front of you, and just watching people's body languages and how they interact and talk with one another without even speaking. And then I really liked this image gravitated towards me because I felt like it's almost like a premonition or a saying in the future, right now grandma is like caring for us and raising us, but then in the end there's one of her grandchildren, they're getting ready to go to church and he's putting her shoes on for her and her house slippers are there that she drove to the church in. So at this point I ended up moving to Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And I was I wanted to bring my work to an international level. Sorry, I've been sick all last week, so my throat's really dry. So, but thank you for whoever ordered the sweet tea, because that's like my favorite drink. You can move me to the north, but you can't take the sweet tea out of me. So, and what quite often happened as working as a photojournalist, you always have daily assignments, and it's always something different. And I think a good practice that I ended up picking up was that I would eventually start seeing narratives within my daily work or themes about that particular region or area that I was photographing. And when I was living in Abu Dhabi, I felt like there was it was 2008 when I moved there, and the country was very young, still about 40 years, about to turn 40 years old. And I felt like there was a big what I was starting to see is like there was a Western part of the UAE, but then there was also more traditional Islamic presence for obvious reasons. And I started seeing and I call it the theme around the project was basically like interrupted identity, because I felt like there was still preservation of trying to live in a traditional lifestyle. I mean, they weren't living a Bedouin lifestyle, but they were still, practicing Muslims. But then you also would have this Western ideology and value system kind of coming in, where there's McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chickens, and even in this picture where the person has obviously more contemporary, like hip style clothing. And then even in the day-to-day life where the camels are highly valued there. This was actually at a camel beauty festival, and then I juxtaposed it with an event at the ocean front, and it's interesting to see the juxtapositions between the two elements in the photograph. And then you would have Emiratis, expats that would come to town, like living in the UAE, dressing as Emiratis, as if they were locals for Halloween costumes. So there's all these strange idiosyncrasies happening within this young country that was very wealthy. And I found it really interesting, even where the landscape, though it was a man-made landscape, the man-made landscape was like mimicking man-built landscape, and the art, and just like the youth culture that was juxtaposed with a Southeast Asian laborer, and even down to the marketing and branding that was presented to people, because like in the States we would never see a truck or of Pepsi or Coke or whatever with people from Southeast Asia. Like, so they're obviously like marketing towards that specific audience. And as I was working in the UAE, I found it a little bit more challenging to really do the type of work I wanted to, because I would often want to photograph topics that address social issues and awareness. Excuse me, but because of the nature of the country and also the paper was owned by the Crown Prince, we really weren't encouraged to shed light on certain things and convey them certain ways. Like for example, I was working on a longer project on the laborers that would come all through Southeast Asia and basically built the infrastructure throughout the country, and that really wasn't something that they wanted to highlight. And I would hit a lot of walls and get frustrated that I wouldn't be able to do work that I felt was important and tell stories that I felt were compelling to our country, or to that country, and to and international, and then also on an international level. So I got really moody, as I do, and my wife was tired of dealing with me. So she's like, "Man, just pick a country and wherever you want to go, and just go there and work on a project." And she's like, "Just get back to your roots, get back to like street photography and doing what made photography enjoyable and what made photography your passion and love." So keep in mind, like Abu Dhabi is like very essentially located to Europe and Southeast Asia and stuff. So I ended up choosing to go to India. And first place I went was Varanasi, which is like the holy city, and it's an ancient holy city. It's very primitive and primal, and it's one of the most amazing places I've been, and I have never been to any other place like that. And what I ended up doing is they have the river there. It's called the Ganges, and it's considered a holy river. And people will bathe in it. They use it for domestic reasons. They use it for religious reasons. I mean, it's got all types for economic purposes, whether they're cooking in it, bathing in it. They usually there's these ghats. They're called ghats, and they're on the shoreline, and that's where they burn their deceased. And then once they burn them, ideally they burn them completely to ash, and then they release them into the Ganges, and it's called moksha, which like releases their spirit so that they don't continue the cycle of life. But more times than not, families can't afford enough to pay for all of the timber to cremate the entire body. So there will be some bodies like coming down the river. And so I ended up, Varanasi is kind of in the center of the Ganges, because it runs from northeastern India down to the south in the Bay of Bengal. And so I ended up going to Varanasi first, and then I came back and was like really invigorated by what I'd seen and wanted to learn more about India. And quite often, like I do when I find a new topic, it's like falling in love to me, where all I can do is like think about that. Like for you who have fallen in love or have had crushes, all I do is like can think about that person. I like just want to talk to them. I want to see them. I want to be with them. And with photo projects for me, it's the same way. Like all I want to do is eat, sleep, drink that particular subject. So came back from India, and all I did was I was listening to Indian music. I was reading about India. I was, planning like what I was going to do next. So I went back several more times, and started following from the confluence of the Ganges up towards the glaciers in northeastern India, and ended up going all the way down to the Bay of Bengal, and just documenting daily life along that river. And I did try to pitch this to the paper I worked for at the time in Abu Dhabi. They had a magazine that ran on the weekends, and it was a beautiful magazine. And I pitched it to them, and they didn't want to do the story. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll just do it myself. So I ended up going and funding it myself. But once you get to India, you can get along fairly cheaply, like less than $100 a week, possibly, depending on how frugal you are. And I ended up doing the project, and then I sold it to the newspaper I worked for about, and I don't usually throw numbers out stuff, but I would like you all to know so you have a sense of like, because when I first got into photography, it was by accident, and I was in a workshop with these legendary journalists, and they were asking when the workshop was over, they had asked me like, well, what are you going to do with photography? I was like, well, it's not my major. It's not my goal. And they encouraged me to pursue it. And I was like, well, you can make a living like doing photography? Like that's crazy. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Yeah, right? And so, and even now today, it's still harder to make a living as a photographer, but it is possible. And like with this particular project, I ended up selling it to them for I think $6 or $7 grand. And I probably out of pocket, my cost of doing business was, if I include the flight, visas, living, like food, housing, and everything that would involve expenses to get there and to fund the project, I think I might have spent between $500 and $800. So pretty good return on investment. And it's like, again, it's not to like say, oh, I made all this money. It's more to encourage you guys and let you know like there is, that's not always the norm. Like you're not always going to make like thousands of dollars off of projects. Then it's getting to be less and less like that. But there are ways to being a successful photographer is just as much about being business minded as it is about knowing your craft. And in some degrees, you will reach a level where you are a solid photographer and you can handle any job for the most part. But it's those of us, like my friends, and I say us, but I mean more there, I have friends who are good photographers, but they're excellent at business, and they're excellent. And with that, that means like marketing their work, building a network of clientele base, being a people person in general. Like there might be two photographers, one's much better than the other, but my one friend, he's such a people person. He can talk to the wall and have a conversation. The wall will start talking to him, And it's that ability to kind of build these relationships and build a business that allow you to succeed financially as a photographer. Because like, yeah, I got to go to India and I've got to live in the Middle East and I've been on assignment over 16 different countries. But, I feel very fortunate that that's the case, but I didn't just shoot things that I was interested in. A lot of times that meant like I did shoot weddings sometimes to feed my family, and I did got hired to go shoot a building, or just things that are very mundane and not that exciting, but it puts food on my table, and then it allows me to fund projects that are more meaningful to me and do things like this. And also it's helpful to have a very supportive spouse, which I did, so, and I still do. And then, sorry, my throat is so dry, and I have a nasty habit, so my throat's even more dry. And during this whole time, my passion was always photography books. Like from the first photo class I ever took, which is what this book is from, I always, for some reason, I don't even really know why, I just gravitated to seeing photography in the book form as the final way of sharing the work. So this was my first class, and I did a 9-image series, and it was called Existential Idiosyncrasies. At that time, I was a double major in philosophy and religious studies, and so I probably was inspired and pulled from that line of philosophy and mindset, and put together this series, and then made a handmade little book and with hand prints. And these prints you can't tell from, but they were really like almost postage stamp size. They were really small, but it was like my introduction to the first venture into figuring out making my own book and like putting something together that was tangible that I could share with people. And then I went on to do a book of street photography when I made the decision to finally pursue photography full time. And I transferred off to Ohio University in Athens. I did an independent study, and the professor helped me put a book together. And I do want to talk a little bit about that in the sense that I originally had taken all the Photo J classes that I could at the university, and then they allowed me, they was like, okay, well, you can take a graduate course. And I didn't go back to college until I was 28 or 29. Never, like I said, never meant to go to college, never intended to go to college. And ended up transferring to a 4-year university. I was at a community college first. And so then as I'm taking this class, I wanted to take this graduate class, and I signed up for it. But then as it got started, I realized that I didn't have the funding to complete the coursework. And because being my late 20s, I was a father already. I was living on my own. I was paying for my own tuition. I was working 2 jobs to get through college, plus selling my plasma to get through college. And so I had to drop the class, but the point is but I thought about my resources, like, well, what can I do? Like, what do I have? How can I move forward? How can I still do something and produce something and grow and learn? And I knew I had a whole bunch before I transferred to the University of Ohio. I had spent the summer walking up and down the beachfront where I lived, just doing street photography. And so I had all these images, but had never done anything with them. So the professor allowed me to do an independent study with him, and I told him I would like to put together a book of my street photography. And he basically was the first one who helped guide me in learning about the process of editing a book, which we don't typically think a whole lot about the sequencing of a book, but there is a rhyme and technique to it. And it's very much like doing a storyboard. If you were to watch a movie and if you study each frame within an actual moving movie, you'll notice like somebody goes to grab a door handle, and then like when they go to open it, it like might lead you into the next scene of a room of a different scene. So you're always building. Each image is like building and has a purpose to carry you through this narrative. So I got to learn a process of doing that, and I continued to make books. No matter where I went, I was working on books, and kind of, as you can see, that was handmade, and that was spiral bound, and then at that point you were able to do those print on demand books. So I started making this book project, and this one, when my wife got into roller derby at some point in our relationship, and that's my wife there, and like she was gone all the time because it was her new passion, and I was all for it because I like skated. And it was before she did derby, I would want to go skating, and it would kind of get a little gruff because it's like, well, I got to be home with the baby, and you're going to go skating all the time. So I was like encouraging her, like, yeah, go do derby, because then you'll have something and I'll have something, and like it'll be a fair deal, and like I can do my thing, you can do yours. But then she was never around. So it's like, well, damn, okay. So I thought about it. I was like, well, derby's like super visual, and like at the time, it was pretty new, the resurgence of roller derby. So then I just started photographing it, and we would travel together, and I would photograph everywhere we went, and it ended up becoming like a larger project and turned into like a book project. And what you'll find is, oh, someone brought me some tea. Who brought this? I need to thank you, whoever did. But what you'll find throughout my work is like I'm often always photographing because of the constraints of either constraints of money, or accessibility, or resources. I always have tried to be very just creative in ways of finding ways to tell stories without having a ton of money. Or even like for this particular book, when I was living in Abu Dhabi, I came back to the States before and was here for the summer. And then when I was traveling back to the Middle East for my last couple months there before I finished my time there, my laptop was stolen in France on the way back to the Middle East. And when I got to the UAE, to do those last 2 months, my boss was just like fed up with me. He was like super annoyed, and we didn't get along that well anyway. We had a lot of difference. Like we butted heads a lot, partially my fault, partially his. We could have handled it better. But so he just put his arms up, was like, whatever, like didn't give me any assignments for 2 months because I had a camera, but I had no way to process the images. which was fine by me because I was like, well, whatever, I'll just collect a paycheck for 2 months. And that's weird that they did that, but they did. But this is when iPhones came out. I was like, well, I've got this phone. And so I just started cruising around and taking pictures of the UAE because I knew it was going to be my last. I think I touched that thing. My computer's like, we got it. Okay, cool. And so I was like, well, this is what I have. I've got this little phone, and I'm just going to cruise around. It's my last, opportunity to live in a country that I may never see again. And I started photographing the region with my phone, and I ended up putting a book out, which was like 3 acts. One was like my last time in the UAE, and then my transition, and then like the third act was like another part of the book. But like, for example, in this picture, or not that one, in this image, like that's coming back to the States where I'm seeing pictures of family on the wall. And I thought that shadow was interesting, that it was kind of, it looked like a mosque, or it reminded me of a mosque, and it's just composed against this cross. So the point is, like, you don't need, people sometimes will ask me, like, well, what kind of camera do you have? You must have a really nice camera, blah, blah. And it's like, no, it doesn't really matter what camera you have. Like, you can produce great work with a phone. In fact, I've shot assignments that paid really well on my whole phone. Like, it was by accident, though. I was going on a family vacation. And I'll share this with you guys, high school students, too, because it's another way of illustrating thinking from a business perspective about how to fund your photography and how to make a living from it. I had gone on a cross-country road trip with my family, my wife and my 2 kids, and I was shooting everything with an iPhone because I didn't want to like bring my real camera with me. I wanted to go on vacation. And so but I was still shooting like my family and like the sights and things that we saw. And when it was all said and done, I was a freelancer at that time, and I had this whole family road trip of pictures, and I was like, oh, what should I do with these? And then my wife, who's been really instrumental in my success and growth as a photographer and as a business person, is just like, she's like, well, why don't you pitch it to Distinction Magazine, which at the time was a regional magazine where I worked. It was a high-end magazine. Their audience and their demographic was geared towards people with like a 6-figure income and so forth. But I won't talk about that. I'm a little annoyed with that. But anyway, they funded me. So I went to them and said, hey, would you be interested in picking up the story on the lost art of the Great American Family Road Trip? And the editor was like, yeah, actually, can you give me like a 10-image edit and like write a proposal and pitch it, give it an official pitch? I said, sure. So I did that, and then making several $1,000s off of that story. They ran like 7 to 8 pages of pictures from my iPhone, wrote a quick little story to go with it. And then the best part of it is I saved all my receipts from that trip, so that vacation became tax deductible, so it was a complete write-off. So these are just ways to like show you guys, like whether you're a child with, trust fund child, or like me and you're funding yourself and you're trying to put yourself through college, and you have a child and you're a teenager, whatever the case, like there are solutions to whatever your life goals are. It's just you have to give yourself the opportunity to believe in the possibilities that are in front of you. And so that led to Black Diamonds, which is why we're all here today for the most part. And as you guys know, you've seen the work, so I'll just flip through that. And people, I get asked quite often, like, what did you learn from your time doing Black Diamonds? Because for you who know, some of the backstory is basically, I moved to Appalachia during the Trump era, and a lot of people were kind of just like, all you're hearing in the news, like, it's racism and prejudice, and, it's because of people in Appalachia, or they're the ones putting Trump into office. And as a person of color, you start worrying, like, you're looking behind your shoulder, which you kind of do anyway, but even more so as Trump, became more a part of the political landscape. And having just moved to Appalachia, I was like, well, okay, I know what I'm hearing, I know what I'm reading. I live in a town of 340 people in Millfield, Ohio. It's a former coal mining town, so I've always been one to want to find out the truth for myself, and I'll take everyone else's opinions in account, but I want to know for myself. So I started going out and photographing my neighbors in my region, and started meeting people and finding out like what was the real truth of my personal experience. And it was very positive. I mean, obviously, I did, come across some racism and prejudice, but nothing more than I've faced, no matter where I've lived in the U.S. or even abroad. So I didn't feel like that would be an honest representation to kind of show racism through those pictures. That wasn't the message that I found. And so as I was working through this book, I started reading more about the little cities of black diamonds, which my region is referred to because of the coal. And I just started reading more and more about the history of the company coal towns. And then I started looking at books and realizing, asking myself, like, well, why are all the photography books mostly done by white males? And how do I change that landscape? How do I, bring a different narrative from a different person with a different life experience? And I started reading, still continuing to read, and like editing my work and reading more history. And even after all this, I'm like, this one says, like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I was just making work and trying to figure out my way. This is a text to a friend that I would also share my work with, and continuing to read and nerd out. And then I started thinking, like, researching, figuring out how books were made, and learning and continuing to teach myself. You can see, like, I just fully nerd out and like highlight stuff, but it was a reference, and I learned a lot and put together a book and actually had my first book published by an actual publisher, and worked with Allison Stein, a writer who did a beautiful job putting kind of the work into a different context, but also complementing the visual storytelling. And I have to agree with her, having lived in Appalachia now, like, I'm certainly changed. And I pondered this question a lot, because one of the questions when I was talking to Will was like, what would be best for the audience? And that was one question, was like, well, what did you learn? And people ask me, like I said, they ask me that all the time, and I've always felt like it was I gave a forced answer, or like slightly, or just kind of like an okay answer, but never really knew what that answer was. And even this time I was looking at my pictures, and I'm like, what? I don't know how to explain what I learned. That's why I take pictures, so I don't have to talk, so I can just let people look at the images and try to gain some insight to those. And so I sat for a while pondering it over and over. I was like, I don't know, man. Maybe I'm an imposter. Maybe none of this is real or true. And I was like, no, that can't be the right answer. Like, what's the answer? And then I started looking at my pictures again as I was putting this presentation together for y'all, and I looked at this one, and this is of Gary. Gary actually has become a very, very close friend of mine now. I really admire him a lot. He's an outdoorsman. I've talked to Will and Molly about him all forever last night. And, he's Appalachian born and bred. He's an outdoorsman. He provides for his family as far as their food. All the food is done through hunting. Like, he hunts deer season. If they're not eating deer, they're eating squirrels or rabbits or fishing or what. All their meat is, basically meat that he's harvested. And I've learned a lot from him as a carpenter. And in this particular image, he actually skateboards too. And here he was injured, and we were waiting for the ambulance to come. And I was like, I'm sorry, Gary. And I just had to make this photograph of him. So the point of that is, like, I've learned to admire people for skill sets that I don't begin to have. And then even in this particular image, this is, to me, this is my backyard, but also, for me, it speaks to the land, because much of the land in the hills where I live don't have any old growth trees. You don't see massive oak trees or the beautiful, just old growth, these, elms and things like that, because all the land was harvested during the coal mining era. Whether it was for timber during industrialization, so people could ship it out and build this country, or whether it was to build tipples for the coal, whatever the case may be, it was all harvested. So now you've got all this new growth of small baby trees, kind of growing and filling the land. So I think for me, looking at this project and learning about the history of the region and finding out, like, well, how did our actions affect the land, and what were the repercussions, and what were the economic reasons and social reasons behind that. And then I learned about the simplicity of where I lived, and the resourcefulness and innovation. It's Halloween and I need a costume. So, and and actually seeing this picture for the first time printed large in the gallery was really had even more impact on me, just being able to see those eyes through the seat. And I think I saw some of you students kind of pointing at that particular picture as well. And it had a lot, it's a very simple image, but just for me, it says a whole lot about the simplicity of childhood and the simplicity of life. And it's something that I think is missing in a lot of our culture and communities today. And then just the simplicity, and just the beauty of country dogs. Like, that's black dog is mine, and the German Shepherd was my neighbor's dog, and they roam free, and they go visit each other, and they play, and they go back home, and they come back and forth, and it's that freedom and that joy of just living a rural lifestyle that's free from worrying about. Well, I worry a little bit that my dog's going to bite somebody, but for the most part, she actually has had her freedom rescinded because she's been chasing after cars and trying to bite their tires. So she's leashed now, but back then she was good. And even the small town beauty pageants, this was Little Miss Moonshine, which when you hear it, yeah, exactly, right? You're like, Miss Moonshine, like, but the thing is, like, the Moonshine Festival actually has a lot of historical value and context to the region, because this was in New Straitsville, another coal mining town that I popped up during the boom time, and but then they, as a labor protest, they lit their field on fire as a labor movement protest, and the repercussions of that is they were no longer to be able to get back into the mines to earn a living. In fact, those mines are still burning underground today from the 40s and 50s. It's no, I'm not kidding you. And so their solution was, during the Prohibition era, they started making moonshine, and their moonshine was apparently so good that there would be places up in Chicago that would make bootleg moonshine and put the New Straitsville label on it and try to sell it as New Straitsville moonshine. So a lot of their economy ended up shifting into moonshine, and that's how they were able to keep their families involved and move forward. So yeah, when I first heard, like, oh, let's go to the Moonshine Festival, I'm like, what? That's going to be hilarious. But when I got there, I was like, this is pretty rad. Like, there's actually history and meaning and culture and heritage behind it. And then I also learned, like, even just my neighbors. This is my neighbor's goat, Rocky, and that goat's, along with a bunch of other herds, goats in that herd, ends up putting out manure, and that's manure that my neighbor put in the back of my truck, and I took to our garden, and it's being fertilized into our produce, and that's how I feed my family. And from a rural perspective, you're building community, and it's like one another, we're looking out for each other, and I learned about the community in that sense. And then even working and meeting Roberta, this 90-year-old woman who had tons of stories to tell me about living through the Great Depression in Appalachia, and being so proud that her mom and her family never even took any charity. Charity by meaning she said, no food stamps, no government help, and she was very proud of that. I have no problem with people taking food stamps. I mean, I was on food stamps many times to help me get through my life and to get to where I needed to be. And gratefully, I don't have to be on food stamps anymore, but I get it. And so, but it's hearing stories like this about these people, and these are just small vignettes of the things that I learned by working on this project. And as I worked on it, I realized I was asking about our use of land and the type of and some of these pictures ended up making it into my second book, Little Cities. But my biggest question ended up becoming like how indigenous peoples and the descendants of settler colonists inhabited and utilized the land before us. And oops, I switched back there. So I was just looking at the man-altered landscape and looking at how these different cultures were leaving their presence on current land. And I did that also by putting these little vignettes of the sacred Indian burial mounds, where these were like 1,000-year-old mounds that were put out for the Hopewell and Adena tribes, and now we have houses around them, which I thought was really speaks for itself. And so I kind of went through that community and just started moved away from the post-industrial coal mining boom towns, and was kind of going even farther back, deeper back into the Adena and Hopewell indigenous era. And even in this particular graveyard, there's like tons of generals buried among the Indian mound. Like, I think more Revolutionary War generals buried here than anywhere else. And then looking at like the remains of what we were leaving behind as a modern industrialized culture. This is actually from a coal mine that's about 5 minutes from my house. And then lastly, like now I'm working on a third book, and recently this magazine had reached out to me, and because I did give you a few posts here and there on my Instagram feed, and they asked about this particular picture, and the project is called 1804. And 1804 is essentially, it's the year that the university was founded where I live. And the reason I'm naming that is because during COVID, I realized that the university was having trouble, and a lot of my friends, including myself, were laid off from our jobs. And if you live in anywhere near where I live, you either work for the university or you work in the service industry. And if you work at and the only way to really make it, well, not the only way, but most of the time, if you're going to make a good, decent living, you're going to work for the university. And once that university is gone, that community would not exist in the way that it does today. So that kind of got me thinking, and I was like, wait, I was working on the former coal mining boom towns of Appalachia, and here I am. I'm living kind of a modern day iteration of a company town, because if the university were to go under, as I saw it kind of with all its cutbacks and losing my job, I also saw a lot of the businesses uptown, the small businesses, closing down because they didn't have the revenue of the students coming through. And I saw my neighbors and my friends losing their jobs, and people wondering, like, what are we going to do? We can't find a job during COVID, and you guys lived it, And so it was a very nervous, wracking time. And so I started photographing that. But then as I was working on it, COVID ended, money was starting to come back into the local economy. And the projects, as most do, tend to kind of take their own journey, and they take you with it, and if you allow yourself to. So then I started just thinking about the ways in which cultural heritage, socioeconomics, and youth culture are shaped by a dominant economic institution, being the university, and then wanting to show how that institution has kind of created a liberal bubble within like a usually fairly conservative political state. And so I've been out photographing the town and different people. And I also thought what's interesting is, at least where I live, it's predominantly, I don't know the percentage, but I'd say probably at least 95% of it's white. And then the rest is like a mixed, whether you're black or Asian or indigenous, whatever, the numbers kind of trickle out. But what's unique about the little bubble of Athens is you do actually have some degree of diversity, not the diversity that you would find in like contemporary cities or major metropolitan areas, but diversity nonetheless for a rural Appalachian town. So what I'm just trying to do now, it's a work in progress, and I'm just photographing the youth and the students, the mom and pop stores, the different races, you can call this art, or I'm not sure, but it just kind of speaks to a different audience. Housing is a big issue there because everything's become student rentals, and some of those rentals are unsafe. Some people refer to it as the student slums. Random oddities and more youth. I mean, I'm 50, but I feel much older living there because everybody's like 10 years old. But no, everyone's like in their teen, like, college age, like you got, and so you walk around and, God, I'm so old. And then, just like pictures like this, just showing like a modern building balancing between, a classic vehicle and an aging vehicle. The people who live there, the townies that are serving these younger people of the LGBTQ community, and then even the unhoused people, which we have very few of, but you do find them from time to time. And this one I felt was pretty striking. And this man they've been together for, I think, 10 years, and the woman is blind, and they are unhoused, and he takes care, kind of as like her guide. That's kind of where I was at. But now I'm gonna bring you all the way back to the beginning and just say, like, basically that's me. Almost a year ago, I just finished building my ramp, and like I still do what I've been doing since started at 12, started taking photos of skateboarding around that age, not with any purpose of like doing photography, but it just kind of sort of happened. And now I still skateboard. I try and get what I can get, whatever my legs will give me. And I'm still rolling though. And like, that's my thing. I do photography, I skateboard, I make books, and I try to like learn from all of those things and somehow put it together into the work that I do. And that's it. So.
Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Facun?
Don't be shy. Oh, yeah.
So while you were doing your street photography, like so many things will be going around you, and how to choose one thing that you want to click, and at what moment you think that is going to be my picture, and how you were training yourself, and how you became good.
Oh, okay, yeah.
From your beginning days.
So you're saying like when I do street photography, how do I know like this is the picture that is a good one? And then the second part of the question I think is like how did I use that to get better, or?
Yeah, how did you get better from what mistakes have you done?
Oh, okay,
basically.
yeah. How do you get better by making mistakes?
Yeah.
Just like that. You know, you think about it, you know, baseball, right? Or even cricket.
Yeah.
It's like baseball, how many times do I have to, if you're at bat, how many times do you have to swing to make a home run? You might get first base, second base, but even then, how many times do you have to be at bat before you can score? And the same way with like anything you do, whether it's photography, I think, or carpentry, or any trade, anything you do, teaching, even making a hamburger, washing the dishes, you just get better because you continue to, if you're consciously, I think, making an effort to build that skill set, and you go and you make pictures, and then you come back and you look at them and you kind of dissect them, and you're like, this is good, but how can I make it better? And even today, if I make a photograph, I still will look at it and obsess over it and pick it apart and wonder like, well, this exposure was just a little bit off. Even today, I was the first time I saw the show, and I was with Will, and I'm walking through, and first I looked at it without my glasses, and then I put my glasses, and I loved it, and I still do, but then I put my glasses on, and I was like, this could be better if I just squint my eyes, because it's not quite exactly, it should be a little bit sharper, or it should be, the exposure could be, you know, and I'm still nitpicking it. So it's really just being open to being open to criticism from your peers and from your for those who know more than you, and being coachable, being able to take criticism, and I think really that's the biggest asset, because there are students that I mentor or work with, and the ones I find that seem to grow the fastest are the ones that are like sponges, and they're also very flexible, because if you're stiff like a tree, and the wind blows, you'll fall over, but if you're flexible, you live longer, right? So, and you can sustain the pressure of the wind. So I think that if you're open to being honestly receiving, like when I work with students and tell them like, this is how you can improve this is the direction you might want to try. I will never tell you must do it this way, because I think people should have that opportunity to discover the joy of learning on their own. But I will try to guide them and tell them, try this approach, try this technique, move this, try that. And that way, those people who then take that criticism and are not defensive tend to grow very fast, because they absorb it and they go and try to apply that idea to their photography. And I really am impressed when I see like how I have some students, like they grow so quickly. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to tell you any more secrets, because you need to earn some of these and figure it on your own. And then as far as for street photography, it's just a lot of walking, and it's good for your health anyway. So I just go out, and I've always loved to walk and look at people and stare at things, and it gives me an excuse to just see the world. And I try to frame it up and photograph it, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And there are a lot of different techniques that street photographers take. Some will, and then in some cases I've done this where I will scout a location, and I'll see like I'll see the background that I really like, whether it's the wall or the texture or the way the light's falling or a combination of all those things. And then I just wait for the elements to kind of fall into place. And I also am a very big believer in manifesting things. And maybe that's a little bit esoteric, but sometimes, for example, when I was first getting in photography, I had an assignment for the student newspaper, and the story was to illustrate illegal couches. Couches were illegal to be on porches. They couldn't have them on porches anymore. And this is very similar to street photography. So I said, man, how am I going to make a good picture of this? You know, it's just a couch on a porch. There's nobody there. Like, and then I was thinking, I just wish somebody was like maybe picking at the couch, moving it away, or doing something to the couch. And I kept thinking about that over and over. And then, like, I kid you not, like a few minutes later, two boys come out, pick up the couch, and start moving it across the street. And so I really, truly, and there's been more instances than just one where I've like been at a spot and like, I just really want this to happen. I want this to happen. I want this to happen. And then it just does. And like I said, it's maybe esoteric, but like it works sometimes. And it's just, sometimes it's just patience. Maybe it's just luck. Maybe it's going back to the same spot more than once. But a lot of times though with street photography, I'm just cruising. I'm just enjoying my walk and like enjoying looking, and I can't be around people though when I do that. Like sometimes I'm with my family on vacation or stuff, and it doesn't work because I can't give them the attention that I should. And so it's a very independent and selfish act. But so I tend to do it by myself. But really, I just enjoy going for walks, and it's really knowing like where to put yourself. Like, where are people going to be? The market, or is there a certain street where there's always a lot of pedestrians or things that you're attracted to, that you gain a response from, something that moves you? Because if it moves you and you're reacting to it and you photograph it, hopefully you're able to capture that emotion and inspiration, and then it makes a great picture that other people will respond to in the same way that you did, the reason why you took it. So, and then sometimes I don't even think about it. I just take a picture because I feel like something's there, and then later on I find that, hey, there was something there. So did that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
A great series of photographs.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think when we see Appalachia depicted in pop culture, there's a tendency among folks to fall into this trope of, behold the poverty, the addiction, the crumbling infrastructure. So just based on your experiences shooting Appalachia, what do you think are the sources of joy that draw people to the region, or makes it so hard for others to leave? Sort of that magnetism that keeps people there? Because unlike other rural areas, Appalachia is extremely unique, right? So
yeah, I mean, at least to me, I feel like it's very unique. I mean, that's been my opinion. That's a good question. I think, I can't really speak for like what keeps Appalachians in Appalachia, because I feel like I would probably I would be an injustice, because I have a degree of resources that are not necessarily available to people who are born and bred in Appalachia. Not all Appalachians, but there are some, so let me think on that. But I think in regards to what you said earlier about, talking about Appalachia, typically is photographed in the very, pop culture is kind of like the cliche, I think is what you're asking about, right? Like, I struggled a lot with that, when I started to photograph. At first, admittedly, I didn't realize the stereotypes that were often depicted of the region. I had gone to school and lived there previously, but never really photographed it in the way that you're talking about. That was never like something I was pursuing. And then when I moved back as an adult and was working on this Black Diamonds, I wasn't again still aware that, of the history, the photographic history of the way the community or the region was depicted. But as I was getting into it and reading, like I've shown some of the slides where I was reading this book and reading that book, then I started to learn more about, like many other underrepresented communities, this particular community was also being portrayed in a way that wasn't necessarily accurate. And so I did do a lot of research on the type of photography that had already been done there. I think a lot of what you're referencing, and tried to not, like you'll notice, like in a lot of my earlier work, is it's very moody and dark in certain areas. But with the Black Diamond stuff, I really tried to use light in a way that was really neutral. So there wasn't a harsh lighting, moody lighting that would move you to think or feel one way or the other. I was trying to do kind of like almost like a blind neutral documentation of what was like right in front of me without trying to sway the viewer to expose this for poverty. Like, and even like there's a picture in the gallery of the little boy in the pool, and I responded to that. I just saw kids in the pool, and I was really excited to photograph them. I had seen them many times before. I'd driven past their house like multiple times over the course of the book project. And one day I finally decided to stop, and I wasn't seeing all the ribs, and like his ribs were very visible. And I remember when that picture had been seen somewhere, I think maybe in Washington Post or some major publication, a lot of comments were about him looking malnourished and things like that. And it took me back because I just felt I was experiencing that photograph more through my personal experience. Like for me, it was a beautiful experience. I got to meet the kids and the dad, and we were hanging out, and it just happened to be a moment. I wasn't seeing and this kind of goes back to the gentleman's question over there. Like sometimes I have big pictures and I don't necessarily see what's there. I just have a feeling and I photograph it. And in that particular photograph, I wasn't seeing like a malnourished kid. I just saw like some kids having a good time in a cool looking area, and like that I always had passed by multiple times and wanted to meet them and photograph them, not realizing that another message might be interpreted through that. But so I've always been reluctant to show that picture a lot, but in that particular edit, I felt like I needed to show a little bit of that. And I didn't want to like be dishonest, and because clearly like poverty does exist in Appalachia, but I also didn't want to beat a dead horse, like, okay, we get it. Like there's poverty in Appalachia, but I was hoping to bring something new, or a new message or a new voice, and a new perspective to kind of an old topic, and do it in a way that was respectful and but honest, I hope. And then as far as like people staying in the region, I can't really speak to like why. I can speculate that many people in Appalachia that were born and raised stay there because they don't have the resources to go elsewhere, whether it's through food deserts, they can't even get the right amount of food they need, or some people, they're like, well, why don't you just move? It's like, well, some people don't have a car to even go get a job so that they can save money so that they can move. Where I live, we don't even have broadband internet. It's not even an option. We don't have, city trash. You got to bring your trash to the dump. We don't have a lot of the modern amenities that are available to most people in U.S. culture. That's fine with me. Like I'm down for that type of lifestyle, but I just don't think they have the resources if they were going. A lot of people are like, oh, well, there's no more work for coal miners. Why don't they just move? And it's like, well, you're talking about generations and generations, and 4 or 5 generations, which I'm sure exists here in Alabama too. But on the farming side, of generations that have lived in this region, and like I'm just going to take my grandmother and my great grandfather and my kids, and then we're going to go where? Like we live in a trailer, or we live in a home that was built by my great great grandfather. That's maybe 600 square feet. I mean, there's very limited resources. So my assumption is that they just don't have the luxury of having the option to leave the area. So that's maybe why they stay. And that's all speculation. For me, I stay there because I've lived all over the world, and I've lived all over the U.S. As a single man and also as a father. And I can say honestly, like it's the one place out of everywhere we've ever lived as a family that all of us have fell in love with, which I still am kind of baffled by, because it is not a very diverse community, and I am the only one of maybe 5 indigenous people that live there. There's not a lot of diversity, but I'm loved there. Like people are giving me, like the other day, my neighbors, I was sick for all week, and my wife was away on fire duty in California, and like she reached out to our neighbor and was like, hey, Rich would never ask for help, but like he's really sick, and Opal is sick, and Levi is sick, and He's taking care of them and trying to feed them, and then we've got our chickens and our animals and stuff, and he's taking care of them at the same time. And I pull up from coming back from the doctor's office, and there's a basket, pretty big basket, like full of, there's like a new blanket, like a soft blanket, Epsom salt, day and night flu medicine. They know I'm vegetarian, so they made me vegan chicken soup, like a big pot of it, massive pot of it. These cough drops that are in my pocket, they brought over to me. And just a bunch of, like a huge care package, just didn't ask for it, didn't ask for anything back. They just dropped it off, and they're like, hey, we've got here, this is for you. And so like people, like at least my community, they look out for me and we look out for them. And everyone's very accepting. My youngest child is trans, and like nobody has ever once mistreated or even made me feel like, because when you meet someone and they're like, they don't necessarily approve of you, of whatever that issue may be, but they'll just kind of nod and be subtle and like just kind of move on. But I've never even received that type of treatment. They've always been really just like embraced, you are who you are, we are who we are, and like, you're my neighbor, you're my friend, and what can I do? How can I help you? And that's something that is really unique to anywhere I've ever lived. Like, I've seen little vignettes of that, like in different places I've lived, but I've never felt a community like be so non-judgmental, but not have their hand out and not like ask or expect something in return. And even those who have less are always the fastest to give the most of what little they have. And I just find that extremely admirable, and that's why I stay. So.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here today. We've come to the end of our time. If you want to stick around for a few minutes, I'm sure Rich could answer some additional questions if you have them. But otherwise, thank you very much for being here. And the next CRCV event is?
October 27th, I think. It's that week, so please join us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. I wipe my hand off with it. I've been coughing it. Let me just give you a fist bump. Because I got a little cough there.
Send me an email. I can send you a link.
Oh, okay. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Frank. I appreciate it. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Portraits of I loved all your photos for different reasons. The portraits of the folks.
Those are my favorite, too. Thank you. Yeah.